If you ask Battlefield fans what they think the best Battlefield of the decade was, you'll likely get one of three replies: Bad Company 2, Battlefield 3, or Battlefield 4. There are a number of ways to evaluate a title from any franchise. This video will examine if the nostalgia for Battlefield 4 is warranted by looking at its successes and failures. So let's start with the improvements Battlefield 4 brought over its predecessors. We have already analysed Battlefield 3 and Bad Company 2 in previous videos. If you haven't watched those yet, you can do so later. For now, here's a quick recap. Bad Company 2 perfected environmental destruction, sound design and gunplay, though it did not quite break new ground in visual fidelity compared to its contemporary competitor, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. It also had a remarkably smaller scope for a Battlefield title, with the notable omission of planes along with the player count capped at 32 players on the PC. These deficiencies were fixed in Battlefield 3, along with a substantial graphical upgrade and an improvement in individual soldier customization. With that said, not all changes Battlefield 3 brought over Bad Company 2 were upgrades though. Battlefield 3 marked a controversial regression in environmental destructibility from Bad Company 2's dynamic destruction that let players reduce entire maps to rubble with explosives and vehicles. Battlefield 3, on the other hand, featured very few structures that you could completely demolish, with destruction being limited to walls and facades. This regression is a common reason cited by Battlefield players to explain why Battlefield 3 isn't their favourite entry in the franchise. DICE took this criticism seriously, and with Battlefield 4, attempted to return destruction to the series with Levolution. This was a collective term for a series of scripted events, one unique to each map. Depending on the map, these events could transform the entire map, like in Flood Zone, drastically altering the flow of combat and viability of certain playstyles. Once the map was flooded, you could no longer walk on the streets and had to stick to the buildings and their rooftops, as swimming in the water left you vulnerable to enemies firing from above. Sure, you could use your sidearm while you're in the water, but you'd stand no chance against enemies firing their primary weapons from dry ground. In other maps, the transformation was more limited and only affected a certain section of the map. Operation Metro, for example, the only Levolution here are a couple of cracks in the ceiling, which is held up by wooden planks. If you haven't seen it in action yourself, it's as contrived as it sounds and seems more like a half-hearted effort to check a box. Then again, the same can be said about Metro being repackaged for Battlefield 4's paid DLC, but more on that later. Even at its most transformative, Levolution felt different from the destruction of Bad Company 2 that so many wanted to experience again. Outside of Levolution's scripted events, Battlefield 4 had few structures that you could raze to the ground. Unlike Bad Company 2, Battlefield 4 didn't allow vehicles to eradicate everything that could have served as cover for infantry. It's understandable why they did this, as fighting vehicles in Bad Company 2 can be a frustrating experience if you can't find shelter. That being said, it was a lot of fun if you were the one triggering the destruction, and it provided a lot of ways to deal with entrenched enemies. Bad Company 2's dynamic destruction not only lent an air of authenticity, but getting to shape your environment also made you feel more connected to the world. You and all other players on the server could see the unique impact your actions left on the environment. Battlefield 4's Levolution, on the other hand, feels much more contrived because of its scripted nature, and after a while becomes predictable and overlookable. You know what structures are coming down, what that process is going to look like, and what the aftermath will be. Admittedly, this allowed the developers to script events of much larger scale, like in Lumphini Garden. Do you think this was an adequate restoration of destruction? Which game do you think did destruction better? Let us know in the comments section below. Destruction wasn't the only feature DICE retrieved for Battlefield 4. Commander mode also made a return, allowing one player to issue orders to the entire team and support them with powerful assists like the AC-130, UAVs and cruise missiles. However, not everybody was a fan of the Commander mode, as it was rare for players to follow the Commander's orders. So let's move on to something Battlefield 4 did better than its predecessors: customization. Specifically with weapons and vehicles. Vehicles saw by far the greatest improvement, so let's begin there. Vehicles now have 5 customization slots: the primary weapon, secondary weapon, the countermeasure, the optics, and the upgrade. For comparison, Battlefield 3 forced you to choose between better optics and a countermeasure. You couldn't equip both zoom optics and infrared smoke as they were both classified as gadgets, and you could equip only one gadget. But Battlefield 3 wasn't the worst, as it did allow you to pick 2 other specializations, 1 upgrade and 1 secondary weapon. Bad Company 2 was even more primitive, offering you only 1 specialization. You could pick either a countermeasure, zoom optics or a secondary weapon. Battlefield 4 has certainly come a long way, offering 5 specializations that allowed for an exponentially greater variety of combinations. What do we mean by that? Let's look at main battle tanks for an example. Battlefield 4's tank has 3 options for its primary weapon, 5 weapons for its secondary weapon, 4 options for its countermeasure, 3 choices for its optics and 4 upgrades to pick from. That amounts to a total of 720 ways to customize your tank. Battlefield 3 in comparison featured 75 different ways of customizing its tank. Bad Company 2? Just 1. Battlefield 4 even introduced separate specialization for gunners in tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, a customization option that Battlefield 3 reserved exclusively for attack helicopters. This doesn't mean vehicles were unilaterally stronger in Battlefield 4, as they were also subject to a new limitation to offset their increased versatility. Most vehicles no longer had the unlimited ammunition they had in previous battlefields. Instead, you only had enough for a few volleys, and if you fired in quick succession, you could run your stock dry. However, ammunition would recharge immediately upon the use of the first round, which spawned a technique that had you expend 1 round to receive an additional volley beyond the intended limit. This trick didn't work on single-fire munitions like the tank's primary cannon or heat-seeking and guided missiles. None of this applies to the smaller caliber weapons such as a minigun and mounted machine guns, as they still had unlimited ammunition like in previous battlefields. Limited ammunition aside, Battlefield 4 didn't just increase the number of options available. It also introduced customizations where none existed in previous titles. As an example, let's look at sidearm customization. Secondary weapons can now equip an optic, an accessory like a laser sight combo and a barrel attachment like a muzzle brake. This customization proved useful while traversing stretches of water, as you can now shoot your sidearm while you were swimming, which you would be doing often as many of the maps in Battlefield 4 were designed with a significant emphasis on water. That might be an understatement, as an entire expansion was dedicated to this environment, Naval Strike. Many would argue that this was the best of the Battlefield 4 DLCs because of the game mode it introduced, Carrier Assault, which was a port of the fan-favourite Titan game mode from Battlefield 2142. This was one of 2 expansions that paid homage to 2142, the other being Final Stand, which featured futuristic weapons like the hover tank. While I did enjoy these expansions, I don't think Naval Strike accurately captured what its maps played like, as there was no naval engagements with larger vessels that typically come to mind when you hear the word Navy. Instead, you were restricted to using the fast attack boats which you might have already been familiar with if you played the vanilla maps. I was hoping we would get to use submarines and destroyers on the open seas, but that would have to wait for another battlefield. I think Coastal Skirmish would have been a better title for this DLC. This isn't a complaint about the maps themselves, as these featured some of the most diverse terrain in the entire game. Wavebreaker, for instance, encapsulated several islands, including a mountain, the inside of which housed a massive tunnel setting the stage for intense infantry combat. Speaking of infantry combat, Battlefield 4 brought a huge improvement with the introduction of assist counts as kill, which gave you the kill credit if a teammate dealt the killing blow to a target you had heavily injured. The Recon class saw the greatest benefit from this new feature, as bolt-action rifles did enough damage even with body shots at their maximum range to qualify for a kill credit if your teammate finished them off. Meaning, you'd still get recognition for your contributions even if you didn't land the headshot for a one-shot kill. This eliminated arguments over kill stealing, making this a feature other companies would do well to incorporate into their games. Coming back to Wavebreaker, the islands allowed for explosive battles between boats and helicopters, while the mountain gave infantry the foothold they needed to intervene by harassing helicopters with heat-seeking missiles. The dynamics of the water was expanded to be more authentic, finally featuring rolling waves instead of the flat surfaces we've seen in earlier titles. You could also dive into the depths to escape incoming fire, which would prove vital in surviving the aftermath of your boat's destruction. You couldn't stay beneath the water forever though, as you would eventually drown if you didn't return to the surface to take a breath. No complaints here, as this is a reasonable and realistic mechanic to give boats a window of opportunity to use their weapons on infantry targets in their domain of dominance. Speaking of weapons, Battlefield 4 also changed what guns would be available to all classes. Semi-automatic designated marksman rifles and fully automatic carbines were now the universal weapons, a change that benefited the Recon class more than any other. Why Recon specifically? Recons could now choose the Spec Ops field upgrade, which immediately allowed them to remain undetected by motion sensors, as long as they weren't sprinting. They could keep playing to receive additional inventory of C4 explosives and motion sensors. This was perhaps the most internally cohesive of all field upgrades. More on those later. Spec Ops allowed Recon players to get up close without getting detected and deal serious damage with their explosives. Carbines complemented this playstyle while providing a weapon that performed reliably at close to medium ranges. Carbines were essentially assault rifles with less damage at range, meaning they weren't very appealing to players running assault or support. That being said, Battlefield 4's carbines were still better than the universal alternative Battlefield 3 provided: personal defense weapons. Battlefield 4 made PDWs exclusive to engineers, but with the exception of the AS-VAL, there was still no point to using them even in close quarters, as fast-firing carbines like the ACWR covered these situations while also being better at longer ranges. Speaking of longer ranges, let's look at the other universal weapon class in Battlefield 4, designated marksman rifles. DMRs suffered a huge nerf in the move to Battlefield 4, now requiring one more shot to kill at close range than they did in Battlefield 3. This rendered DMRs useless on maps like Operation Locker and Metro, as it would be suicide to use a 3-shot semi-automatic weapon against enemies running with assault rifles and machine guns. As if that wasn't bad enough, DMR's long-range capability was crippled by their optics, or rather, the lack of them. With Battlefield 4, DICE made the inexplicable decision to deny the DMRs the ability to equip 8x and 12x scopes. I never understood why they did this. DMRs weren't overpowered in earlier titles that didn't just allow these attachments, but bundled them with DMRs as the default optics. Their removal in Battlefield 4 meant the DMR was hobbled at long range as well. Some might argue that the changes in magazine capacity might make up for this. Battlefield 4 issued most DMRs a 20-round magazine, double that of most DMRs in Battlefield 3. However, Battlefield 3 did have 2 DMRs with 20-round magazines. While one of them, the SKS, had a terrible damage model to offset the increased magazine capacity, the other, the M417, didn't, and was as powerful as most other DMRs, requiring only 2 shots to kill at close range. Point is, Battlefield 4 gave DMRs no buff to compensate for the nerf to their damage and optics. Their weakness makes one wish the developers would return to the game and issue one final patch that restored their Battlefield 3 glory. That brings us to the next reason why many people love Battlefield 4. The developers. Specifically, DICE LA. DICE LA endeared themselves to the community through the effort they dedicated to fixing the game's crippling instability and performance issues, while also improving its netcode and introducing higher tick rates. Even after the game was complete and had shipped all the marketed expansions, DICE LA gifted all players who had bought Battlefield 4 with a stream of free DLC, even if they hadn't purchased the Premium Pass. The first of these content packs introduced 5 guns and ported the Gunmaster game mode from Battlefield 3. The second content pack, Night Operations, launched on September 1st, 2015, and introduced a nighttime variant of a launch map, Zavod. The third of these free DLC was called Community Operations. Released on October 27th, 2015, this introduced a new map developed in collaboration with the community. The last content pack was Legacy Operations, launching on December 15th, 2015. This introduced a remastered Battlefield 2 map, Dragon Valley, with its TDM version drawing inspiration from Battlefield 3's Nosha Canals. Given EA had already charged for Second Assault and Back to Karkand, I wouldn't have been surprised if they had locked this behind a paywall. The fact they didn't was uncharacteristically wholesome for an EA studio, and this is why so many in the community are positive towards DICE LA and Battlefield 4. A cynic might argue that the only reason EA allowed these free DLC was damage control to regain the goodwill of the Battlefield community. Why would they need to, you might ask, if you got into Battlefield 4 years after its release? To find the answer, let's look at why DICE LA needed to step in and fix the game in the first place. Battlefield 4's disastrous launch. The game suffered crippling performance issues, hitching and freezing every other second when it wasn't crashing outright. This instability persisted for months after release, and even if players could somehow manage to avoid crashing their game, the terrible netcode would make firefights an extremely frustrating experience. EA didn't let any of that stop them from introducing loot boxes to Battlefield 4 in the form of battle packs. That's right, EA was selling loot boxes for real money while the game was broken. They were separated into 3 tiers. You could buy a bronze pack for $1, a silver for $2, or a gold one for $3. You could also buy these in bundles of 5 for the price of 4 bought individually. To make matters worse, these battle packs were woven into the progression system, as over half of all weapon attachments were reserved exclusively for these loot boxes. This wouldn't have been as bad if battle packs were merely an additional, optional path to these unlocks. But that wasn't the case. You couldn't unlock these attachments through completing in-game tasks like killing a designated number of enemies. The only way to acquire these reserved attachments was through acquiring and opening these battle packs. And even then you had to be lucky, as there was never any guarantee you were going to get the attachment you wanted. But why does this matter, you may ask? Though Battle Pack awarded grips and muzzle attachments are functionally identical duplicates of accessories you can get by grinding your gun out, scopes are a different story. Most optical sights are locked behind the Battle Pack system, including crucial game changers such as thermal optics, like the FLIR and infrared night vision scopes, which were indispensable on maps like Zavod Graveyard Shift. If you had this attachment, you could still acquire and engage your target in low visibility conditions. If you didn't have this attachment and ran into an enemy who did, you would be at a severe disadvantage in these maps. The only thing you could do was to hope one of the cards the battle packs awarded you was one of these, and not a useless battle log emblem. They had no equivalent that could be unlocked through grinding your gun out. Speaking of grinding, EA weren't content with one pay-to-skip system. They didn't let go of their old schemes either. You could still pay to skip the grind, well, at least some of it, by purchasing shortcut kits. If you think these shortcuts aren't pay to win, this is how EA pitches them. With the Air Vehicle Shortcut Kit, you get immediate access to upgrades that improve the offensive and defensive capabilities of helicopters and jets. Whether you're new to Battlefield 4 or just want to make up for lost time, shortcut kits help you go toe-to-toe with Battlefield veterans by instantly unlocking powerful gear and bonuses that would otherwise be obtained through play. It doesn't matter if you're transporting troops or dishing out destruction from above. These helicopter upgrades will improve your chances of survival. Despite this blatant admission of selling immediate advantages, a few still downplay the impact this pay-to-skip arrangement has had on the series. It was more for new players to instantly skip the grind to be competitive with older players. This justifies the existence of an option to skip the grind, but not the sale of that option for real money. Charging a fee to skip the grind just gives the publisher and developer an incentive to inflate the grind to such a degree that the player would rather just give up and cough up the cash. Loyalists would argue that DICE didn't give in with the Battlefield series. It didn't really take that long to unlock stuff. Prove it. You can't, because Battlefield 4's progression system makes it impossible to quantify the time you need to unlock any item. This is the polar opposite of Rainbow Six Siege, which sets everything at a fixed price in-game currency that you earn by completing matches. Ubisoft makes assessing Siege's grind easier by officially estimating it takes 30 hours to unlock a DLC character. This is not an assessment you can make for Battlefield 4. Why do we say this? Here's a challenge. How long does it take to accumulate the 160 kills you need to unlock the suppressor for Battlefield 4's Bulldog rifle? There is no universal objective answer to this, as it differs for each player depending on skill and the map and the modes he plays on. It is impossible to calculate how long you'll take to unlock everything in any Battlefield. Consequently, it's much harder to conclusively prove if the progression system has been stretched to push players towards the pay-to-win microtransactions. Speaking of which, let's look at a comment which pointed to another aspect of Battlefield as an example of pay-to-win. In the same vein, you could say that the weapons and gadgets that are part of the DLC expansions were pay-to-win, as you had no access to these new toys without paying for the content. That is a valid, if uncommon, criticism of Battlefield's premium expansion packs. Most of the complaints directed at these expansions centered on the player base being divided between those who had purchased the premium pass and those who didn't. While this is a fair argument, it's also understandable why map packs used to be sold for a price. Developers spend a lot of time and resources creating this content well after the game's release, and selling these post-launch maps provided revenue to sustain this continued support. But that being said, I am glad the industry has moved away from selling maps. However, the way Battlefield's expansions introduce new weapons does warrant closer examination. Buying the expansion didn't give you the advertised weapons automatically. Instead, it added assignments which you had to complete to unlock these guns. Either of these requirements would have been understandable on their own, but requiring both did seem rather excessive. I wouldn't mind paying if these DLC weapons were unlocked immediately upon purchase, but that wasn't the case. I wouldn't mind completing the assignments to unlock these weapons if I didn't have to pay for the expansion, but that wasn't the case. Battlefield's expansions weren't just pay to play or pay to skip, they were pay to grind. Pay to skip could have been acceptable for post-launch content like Rainbow Six Siege's season passes, since it does push players towards funding continued development or post-launch content that might not otherwise have been commissioned. Ideally, both post-launch content and maps would be free for everybody like Overwatch, but it would be unrealistic to expect that of any AAA publisher, let alone EA. Even with EA's track record though, Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4's business model was abhorrent. Pay to buy the game, pay again to play the new maps, and pay again to skip the grind. Even after all of that, you could still find some disappointment in reading the fine print. This shortcut kit does not include any gadgets or weapons added by expansion packs. There was no way out of completing the assignments if you wanted to unlock everything. These assignments could get really stupid and borderline unachievable if you were playing against enemies who knew how to press the fire key. The only reliable way to unlock these guns was to partner up with another player and help each other complete these assignments. A few argued these assignments pushed players into playstyles they might not otherwise have used, but I would say this could also have been done with cosmetics as a reward, instead of guns that, depending on their state of balance, can turn the tide of battle in the user's favour. For instance, the Desert Eagle, a handgun that combines the highest damage model of any sidearm with a reasonably large magazine capacity for a pistol of its power, can only be obtained by getting 20 headshots with the Unica 6, a revolver that first has to be unlocked by killing enemies while swimming. These assignments are borderline impossible to complete, and shouldn't have been forced on players who just want to use the best pistol available. A much better way to encourage players would have been to unlock an exquisite weapon skin or dog tag behind those assignments. Despite all of this, a few people still claim to enjoy the progression system, and I wouldn't want to take that away from them. The problem lies with the shortcut kits. It's not that they shouldn't exist. I'm arguing they should be free. If a few players enjoy having to unlock weapons, they should have that choice. Their choice shouldn't be imposed on people who don't want to grind for anything and prefer to have everything unlocked from the start. Sadly, grinding has become an accepted part of gaming culture, though games have moved away from the tedious progression systems in recent times. Here's hoping that trend continues and makes grinding a thing of the past. Even if that happens, it will still be too late for Battlefield 4. Admittedly, they could give the ultimate shortcut away like they did with the handgun shortcut back in early 2014. I don't understand why the Ultimate Bundle wasn't the shortcut that was given away, as this gift was an apology intended to make up for the disastrous launch that left the game unplayable for months. With that said, EA did later give away the expansions and later the Premium Pass to everybody who hadn't purchased it yet. Furthermore, they eliminated the need to use Battlelog by patching a server browser into the game first on consoles in 2016, and then on PC 1 year later. However, they didn't remove Battlelog from the equation and kept it active as an option for those who preferred it. This gives us a unique opportunity to compare the browser-based launcher to a traditional server browser in the game. Personally, I prefer Battlelog, as it gives me a way to search for a server that's playing the map and mode I want before I launch the game, rather than launch the game then find no servers available. What do you prefer, Battlelog or the in-game browser? Let us know in the comments section below. I suspect much of the love for Battlefield 4 is misplaced appreciation for the effort DICE LA dedicated to fixing the game. While DICE LA certainly deserve the praise, the reason they had to step in shouldn't be forgotten. They rescued Battlefield 4 from the mess that DICE Stockholm made. People need to separate the roles of DICE Stockholm and DICE LA in Battlefield 4. They should not let the commendable record of DICE LA sway them into letting DICE Stockholm off the hook. After the masterpiece that was Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4 feels like an uninspired iteration when you boil it down to its basics. Let's begin with the setting. By 2013, the market was already saturated with modern military shooters. The Battlefield franchise in particular had Battlefield 2, Bad Company 2 and Battlefield 3. However, the great job DICE had done with Battlefield 3 surpassed my modern military fatigue with anticipation of what the next Battlefield might bring. Sadly, Battlefield 4 would prove to be as stale as its setting, at least on launch. To learn why, let's look at first impressions, and by that we mean graphics. Battlefield 3 brought a substantial leap in visual fidelity from Bad Company 2, featuring vastly superior lighting, textures, models and particle effects compared to its predecessor. What's even more impressive is the fact that they achieved this leap in a little over a year. Battlefield 4, on the other hand, wasn't quite as ahead of its time as Battlefield 3 was. The visual improvement Battlefield 4 brought over its predecessor was incremental at best. I'd even go so far as to say a few maps looked worse than the best Battlefield 3 had to offer. Altai Range, for instance, looked noticeably uglier than Alborz Mountains or Vandar Desert. After the massive leap Battlefield 3 brought over Bad Company 2 in just over a year, I had high hopes when Battlefield 4 was announced. I was blown away by what DICE had achieved in 1.5 years. I was eager to see what they had accomplished in 2. It would be an understatement to say I was disappointed. That being said, not all modes of Battlefield 4 were equally disappointing. It is interesting Battlefield 4's campaign had far better textures and lighting than its multiplayer, just like its predecessor. If one had to look better than the other, I would have preferred the multiplayer, as that is what everyone plays Battlefield for. You might argue that graphics don't matter, gameplay does. So let's look at the downgrade gameplay suffered in the move from Battlefield 3 to Battlefield 4, specifically in a field of customization. Squad specializations were no longer a thing. You could no longer choose a specialization and have it apply to your whole squad. Gone were the days where a squad could coordinate to give all members increased ammunition, grenades, explosives and flak jackets. Instead, you now had to pick one of 5 field upgrades. Your field upgrade is a tiered list of 4 perks, of which you only get the first to begin with. Earning points by healing, reviving, repairing or resupplying your teammates would unlock higher tiers one by one. If your squad was wiped out, you would drop a tier. Sadly, you could not choose the perks in your tier. For a practical example, you couldn't combine additional ammunition, grenades and explosives to cover all types of engagements as an engineer. You were stuck with the tiers the developers decided on, which was far from ideal as DICE set up some really stupid combinations. For instance, most classes didn't have access to additional ammunition, as the only class that could choose a field upgrade with ammo as its first tier was the support. That's right, the only class that could receive additional ammo from the get-go was the class that has always had not just unlimited ammunition, but the ability to issue unlimited ammunition. Who asked for this change? Who thought that this was a good idea? Well, DICE, obviously. But why? Did anyone complain about Battlefield 3's squad specialization? Not that I could find, but maybe I didn't spend enough time searching. Were you unhappy with Battlefield 3's specializations? Did you think Battlefield 4's field upgrades were an improvement? Let us know in the comment section below. Admittedly, Battlefield 4's perks did introduce new mechanics like vehicles resupplying, repairing or healing allies in close proximity, reducing the length of time you were spotted or, conversely, increasing the length of time enemies stayed spotted. I don't see why they had to be locked behind this asinine tier system. Why couldn't DICE just keep the old squad specializations? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Field upgrades aside, let's look at the second Assault expansion to explore another example of DICE Stockholm's laziness. Remastering maps from older titles isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it had better bring significant improvements if you're going to sell it for a fee. Back to Karkin was an expansion worth paying for, as the maps it remastered were 6 years old at the time, a gap which had been a substantial increase in the standard of visual fidelity. The desaturated colours aside, Back to Karkin infused these Battlefield 2 maps with 6 years of graphical improvement by porting it to the contemporary Frostbite engine. Battlefield 4's second Assault, on the other hand, brought little if any upgrade to the visuals of the then 2-year-old maps it remastered, or should we say, recycled. Furthermore, the maps DICE chose didn't deserve a second look, since they were not the ones that could have taken the greatest advantage of Battlefield 4's new features. You might ask, what maps should DICE have remastered then? Aftermath is the obvious answer. The earthquake-stricken environments were the perfect opportunity for DICE to showcase Levolution's capability. By choosing Aftermath, Second Assault could have shown us what these environments looked like before the earthquake, how horrific the earthquake was in motion, and could have made for an incredibly intense moments as players fought each other while trying to avoid being crushed to death by the falling rubble. Sadly, this isn't close to what we got. What we got was Operation Metro. Who asked for this? What need was there to port Metro when Operation Locker was already in the game, filling the same niche? What improvement did Second Assault bring to Metro to justify selling it for real money? The blue tint was taken care of. Modders had already fixed this in Battlefield 3, but DICE threatened to ban anyone using the mod. I wonder if the plan to port Metro to Battlefield 4 had anything to do with it. Second Assault also let you ride the elevator to switch between the two floors, but doing so in a real match would get you killed the second the doors opened. You could now ignite the grass to spark a slow-moving fire. As mentioned earlier, you could also dislodge a few wooden planks holding up the broken ceiling. Was this worth the asking price? Let us know in the comment section below. Second Assault also ported 3 other maps: Operation Firestorm, Caspian Border and Gulf of Oman. The first two received a few changes that made their names more befitting. Caspian Border now had a border wall, a small section of which could be brought down by toppling a tower. You could also open and shut the wall's gate, as well as shutters on the towers on the walls. And a good opening play in the game was racing around the edge of the map, shooting a hole in the wall and flanking behind them. Operation Firestorm, on the other hand, now had a couple of structural pressure points that could be triggered by gunfire or explosives to ignite a fire in varying persistence. You could also press a button to destroy a crane, commonly frequented by snipers. This model was also recycled in Gulf of Oman. The only difference being its destruction was triggered by a sandstorm that drastically reduced visibility. The inclusion of this map in the premium package is inexplicable. Gulf of Oman was already remastered in Battlefield 3. Why recycle it again just 2 years later? Why didn't DICE just remaster another map from Battlefield 2, one they hadn't already touched up in Battlefield 3? DICE LA went on to do just that with Dragon Valley, a map they released to all players for free. This is why it's important to separate the deeds of the two DICEs, and not let the perseverance of one absolve the laziness of the other. This is particularly relevant considering the recent arrogance of DICE Stockholm, a hubris they might not have displayed if they were still held to task for their woeful handling of Battlefield 4. Their atrocious attitude in the months leading up to Battlefield 5's launch showed they have learned nothing. That makes us wonder what Battlefield 5 would have been like had DICE LA been the ones developing it. Perhaps it wouldn't have been perfect, considering DICE LA has made games before, namely the Medal of Honor reboot and its ill-fated sequel. But perhaps their heroic rescue of Battlefield 4 gave them the skills and experience they need to return to developing their own games. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. That concludes our retrospective analysis of Battlefield 4. If you like this video, please share it. There is more content like this on the way. Please like, subscribe and press the bell button so you don't miss out. While you're here, feel free to watch our analysis on Denuvo's history and performance impact, our analysis of Battlefield 5's controversies and our hardware analysis of CPUs and graphics cards. We have a secondary channel, link is in the description and on the screen. Please subscribe, and don't forget to press the bell button.